So throughout this presentation, we're going to be talking about carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. So what is that? We use the definition that's provided by the CDR primer. This is an excellent resource. It's now a textbook available for purchase, but it defines carbon dioxide removal as being activities that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs, or in products. So here on our graphic, you can see carbon in the atmosphere, ultimately making it to one of those destinations. It is notable that the carbon dioxide removal is different from carbon capture, which refers to capture at point sources rather than removal of atmospheric or legacy carbon. So when you see CC or hear carbon capture, you might think about smokestacks, while carbon removal refers to pulling legacy carbon out of the atmosphere. Unpacking terms a little bit more, conversations about both carbon removal and carbon capture are often paired with the concepts of storage and utilization. Essentially, the question is, what are you going to do with the carbon once it is removed or captured? In general, utilization refers to activities that make productive use of the carbon, and in so doing, the carbon is ultimately released into the atmosphere. So one example of this would be the production of synthetic fuels. When burned, a syn fuel that is made either from captured or from removed carbon releases carbon into the atmosphere. And you can see here that the carbon pathways that I've drawn in with the arrows for carbon removal with utilization, that's ultimately circular. It goes from the atmosphere to a fuel back into the atmosphere. While the carbon pathway for carbon capture with utilization, also known as CCU, that's more linear. It goes from these non-atmospheric sources into a syn fuel and ultimately into the atmosphere. Storage tends to refer to activities that durably lock up the removed or captured carbon. Geologic storage is perhaps the most poignant example. I think of this sometimes as trying to put the toothpaste back into the tube. The idea behind geologic storage is that rocks and geologic formations have already demonstrated their aptitude as a carbon storage container, having held large carbon reservoirs for millions of years in oil and gas reservoirs, and they could become carbon containers again. The carbon pathway for carbon removal with storage is linear from the atmosphere directly into storage. The carbon pathway for carbon capture with storage, also known as CCS in some spaces, is also linear from non-atmospheric sources into storage sources. In this way, you can see how carbon removal with storage is a solution that addresses legacy emissions, while CCS is more of a reduction or an avoided emission. And then there are some solutions that do a little bit of both. They may store some carbon and release some carbon upon utilization, as well as some solutions that also just demand examination of language. For example, while concrete is capable of durably storing removed carbon or captured carbon, sticking concrete in the storage-only bucket would deny it the well-deserved recognition of having tremendous utility to humanity. So capture may or may not be a good climate solution depending on the specific context, but one thing it is not is carbon removal. And so I just wanted to kind of set that table and to emphasize that for the remainder of this event, we will be focusing on carbon removal. So this image from the National Academy of Sciences sort of sums up some of the big categories of carbon removal solutions that are being researched and deployed. You'll see that all of the pathways start from the atmosphere. And then there are some sort of pure play nature-based solutions. Those are seen with the afforestation and the reforestation images on this. There are some engineered solutions seen with the direct air capture and the accelerated weathering solutions. And there are some hybrid solutions, often with biomass performing sort of the atmospheric removal portion, and then engineering providing the storage solution. And just as a reminder, Liz Ware from NREL is working with a lot of partners in this sort of hybrid space. Great, so up till now I've been covering the what of carbon removal. In the next few minutes, I'm going to be covering the why. And the why of carbon removal is that years ago, we arrived at a moment of scientific consensus that says it is necessary. Indeed, the 2018 IPCC panel on climate change has clearly stated that, and then reiterated with their summary for policymakers, bluntly stating that all pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius use carbon dioxide removal. And that unless affordable and environmentally and socially acceptable carbon dioxide removal become feasible and available at scale well before 2050, pathways to 1.5 degrees will become difficult to realize. So while it is clear that carbon removal is now necessary, at Four Corners, we do always like to take a moment to pause and state clearly that nobody working in the space of carbon removal considers carbon removal to be in any way, shape, or form a substitute for emissions reductions. We absolutely must reduce emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and as completely as possible, full stop. That said, we're not going to be able to reduce all of our emissions in a just or climate relevant time frame, and we are also going to need carbon removal. Perhaps the most popular analogy for this idea is that of the overflowing bathtub, with the faucet and tap blasting and the drain just trickling. We absolutely need to turn off the taps as quickly as possible, but we also need to support the existing drains and perhaps even open up some new ones. However, while supporting and opening drains via carbon removal will be necessary, it will not be sufficient on its own. Nobody is saying that carbon dioxide removal is a silver bullet. And nobody in the space thinks of it as being a replacement for reducing emissions as quickly as possible. Both must happen simultaneously and in parallel. So we must continue to prioritize emissions reductions. The fact that the arrival of carbon removal to the discussion is not an excuse to let go of that rope. However, we are not going to be able to reduce, again, in a just or climate relevant time frame. And while there are some historical and philosophical reasons for social and political resistance, at Four Corners, we believe that it is productive to recognize the both and situation that has arrived and to work with communities to become more familiar with this emerging sector and to figure out socially acceptable paths forward. So on the topic of familiarity, one resource that I would recommend to any person or community looking for a starting point would be the Oxford Offsetting Principles. This is a paper that was released in 2020. And this resource provides a framework to characterize activities based on whether they were a removal or an avoided emission, as well as their permanence, the risk of reversal, the duration of storage, and more factors. I will not unpack this resource any further, but I certainly want to acknowledge that the quality is an important layer of this conversation. And so this graph does come from that previously mentioned IPCC report. We have added the red lines and the text to help with some orientation. And it shows that, in fact, even in the most optimistic emissions reduction scenario, the scale of carbon removal that will be required by mid-century is on the multi-gigaton per year range, or approximately the same amount that the United States currently produces. So furthermore, assuming that we are successful in achieving net zero emissions globally by mid-century, a safe and healthy climate will require that the ongoing removal of legacy emissions from the atmosphere at continued gigaton scale for decades to come. So for all of these reasons, carbon removal is an essential climate solution. Along with reducing and adapting to our already changed climate, we need to be working on all of these together at the same time. This is another graphic showing much of the same and adding the relevant layer of other non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases. Many folks find this one to be a little bit more comprehensive or potentially even easier to digest than the IPCC graph, so I just wanted to provide it here. This one also comes from the National Academy of Sciences. And often after reviewing these graphs, people will tell me that they find themselves a bit overwhelmed by the scale and the magnitude, and they'll ask if there's any reason for optimism. And I will take a moment to offer some. I like the framing that one of the titans in the carbon removal space, his name is Dr. Klaus Lochner, will often offer. And he puts up these two photos. If we anticipate that new engineered solutions or machines are going to be part of the portfolio of solutions, then history has shown time and again that we are capable of very quickly ramping up production from zero to significant scale. The photo on the left was taken in 1990, and if you look at it, there are 0 cars on the road. A few short years later, the photo on the right is from 1913, and cars dominate the same streets. Indeed, we went from the first Model T in 1908 to nearly 60% of American households with an automobile in their house in just about 20 years. Now, if we are thinking that the task will require more than just the capacity to build machines, but also centrally coordinated systems and infrastructure and things of that nature, then we might consider the distribution systems and networks that were required to deliver electricity, or the plumbing and treatment facilities that were needed to support a flush toilet in nearly every home, both of which saw massive build out on the timescale of just a few decades in the United States. And every time that I flash this graph, I am sort of re-surprised to learn that electricity was ahead of flush toilets in the United States households for most of the 20th century. Which just makes it extra bonkers to my 21st century brain that for a period of about 15 years in the 1920s and 30s, more US households had a car than a flush toilet. Now, many of you are probably aware that these rapid growth or adoption curves are sometimes referred to as having this sort of hockey stick pattern, a bit of a flat bottom, but then they hit this inflection point. And solar may be just one of the most relevant comps for carbon dioxide removal. Growth was slow for a long time, and then installations started to increase rapidly in the 2010s. At the same time as this sort of rapid hockey stick deployment and capacity growth, we also began to see rapid price decreases. Here you can see that the price of solar 50 years ago was well over $100 a watt, and today the price is closer to 25 cents per watt. Indeed, this story is chronicled in a 2021 paper by the previously mentioned Dr. Klaus Lachter, as well as Iserbadi at the Center for Negative Emissions at Arizona State. And they showed that the solar experienced a better than 1,000 or 100-fold decrease in price as a result of capacity build out over 35 years. And they suggest that given the fact that direct air capture actually has an easier path. Indeed, with the price of direct air capture in 2019 being around $600 a ton, DAC would only need a 10 times decrease in price to reach the price targets ranges that have been floated around by experts. If DAC were to follow a similar path as solar, a 10x price decrease could be achieved in less time and with less capacity build out than many others expect. Just as a note, if you're interested in like unpacking and understanding this a little bit more, Jason Hockman often has presented with one of the authors of this paper and is pretty well versed. And indeed, this optimistic outlook is time and again that we underestimate cost curve declines. This graph comes from the climate page of the fintech company Stripe, where they lay out similar theses showing that price declines of many technologies and suggest that carbon removal could follow a similar path. All right, so quick check-in on my agenda. So far, I've reviewed things at the 30,000-foot altitude. I'm now going to descend to 10,000 feet and review some of what is happening at the national, regional, and sector levels. At the federal level, the Department of Energy is who is leading the charge on all things carbon capture, carbon removal, storage, etc. The Department of Fossil Energy became the Department of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management on July 4th, 2021. So they just had their 2-year-old birthday. On their website, you can find the claims that our new name is also a new mission, and a quote that the change in name recognizes that to meet our climate goals, we have to manage the carbon that comes with the legacy and continued use of fossil fuels. The FECM also announced that their so-called Earth Shots in 2021, including a carbon negative Earth Shot that seeks to support the carbon removal ecosystem to arrive at solutions within 1 decade that can durably store 1 ton of carbon for less than $100. Also at the federal level, the federal government does have a tax credit for carbon capture and or carbon removal. It is known as 45Q. If you are familiar with the renewable energy space, then you're probably familiar with the investment tax credit or ITC, as well as the production tax credit or PTC. Like these other tax credits, 45Q has been updated a handful of times since its inception in 2008. And according to sources at Climeworks, a direct air capture company, there is no question that investment from the federal government helped to make solar and wind the cheapest and cleanest energy sources for today's grid, and the government has an opportunity to do the same now with carbon removal. At a regional level, residents and communities in New Mexico should become aware of the iWest initiative. iWest stands for the Intermountain West Energy Sustainability and Transitions. iWest is a massive regional planning and infrastructure effort that is sponsored by the Department of Energy and led by Los Alamos Labs, right there in New Mexico. They recently published their Phase 1 final report. And the iWest initiative is about more than just carbon removal. It does include planning related to hydrogen and other initiatives. But when you look at the table of contents of the Phase 1 report, you can see that the first 4 sections are all related to carbon capture, carbon removal, and storage. In addition to Los Alamos, the universities of New Mexico Tech, and San Juan College are all partners. So this is incredibly relevant to residents and communities in New Mexico. And at 2 years old, this slide is starting to get a little bit dated. But when I consider the emerging sector of carbon removal, two of the earliest shifts came from corporate entities. Stripe and Microsoft were two of the earliest. They have since been joined by others with similar philosophies. And you can see here some of what they posted on their pages. Stripe put out the thesis that traditional offsets, while often inexpensive, are unlikely to scale to the size of the climate problem. Instead, we've chosen to focus on permanent carbon removal strategies. Similarly, Microsoft said that like most carbon neutral companies, Microsoft had achieved carbon neutrality primarily by investing in offsets that avoid emissions instead of removing carbon that has already been emitted. This is why we're shifting our focus. But Stripe decided to move from offsets to having a 2-to-1 investment ratio in carbon removal, and Microsoft deployed a $1 billion fund over the next 4 years, which they would invest in new carbon dioxide removal technologies. And as an early leader that was transparently putting forward their thesis on carbon removal in 2022, Stripe was positioned to spin up an initiative that is known as Frontier. Frontier has raised over $1 billion from other companies and is using that capital to purchase carbon removal via advanced market commitments. The entire portfolio of projects selected by Frontier can be seen on their website. Prize competitions are also providing capital to the emerging sector of carbon removal. The XPrize seeks to support and catalyze innovation in many different domains, including carbon removal. And indeed, I believe the $100 million prize for carbon removal is the largest XPrize purse on record. So far, 15 milestone winner teams have been awarded $1 million to recognize their efforts to date. And by 2025, the overall winners will be awarded an additional $80 million. Okay, looking back at the agenda, I will descend a little bit further in altitude. We'll go to that 1,000-foot level and start to preview some of the opportunities that might be particularly well suited for New Mexico. So this is the suite of opportunities that we've identified to discuss today, as well as a quick reminder of some of the specialties of some of our panelists. We'll discuss some nature-based and hybrid solutions, which again, Liz Ware and NREL. Concrete, you can ask us at Four Corners about it, Chris Neidel in particular. Orphan well plugging, Janice Hallowell is very well versed in this. Anything DAC, that is going to be Jason Hockman, and procurement, Kyle Clark-Sutton would be an excellent resource. Biomass carbon removal and storage, or bikers. Once again, you might think of this as sort of those hybrid solutions where perhaps it is biomass that does the atmospheric removal piece, and then humans get involved in order to either stabilize the biomass so that it doesn't get back into the atmosphere, or otherwise sort of do the storage approaches. Liz is looking at numerous biker solutions in collaboration with all of the partners, the companies that you can see at the bottom of this slide. We've got Charm and Carba, Moat, Isometric, Stripe, Kodama, Yale Carbon Containment, and Arbor. And I know that Liz is particularly interested in monitoring, measurement, reporting, and verification of these approaches. I've added the red circle to this slide over here, and you can see some of the stabilization or storage approaches, essentially doing engineered things in order to take biomass and turn it into perhaps bio oil or biochar, torrefied biomass, and even thinking about storing it underground and in other places. Biochar is an example of a biker strategy. Once again, the biomass does that atmospheric carbon removal, and then people use engineered systems to stabilize a significant portion of the carbon via pyrolysis. The pyrolysis can also be used to generate bioenergy and or useful heat. And the resulting char is quite stable and unlikely to return to the atmosphere for centuries. The char can be used as a soil amendment, particularly helpful for water retention, which could be very useful in arid states like in New Mexico. Biochar efforts can be used to support forest restoration efforts, as it provides beneficial and potential economic use of liability biomass that has really become a bottleneck in overgrown forests all over the American West. I know those of you in New Mexico are no stranger to bad air pollution days because of the fires. In addition to Liz Ware from NREL, Janice Hallowell is also very well versed in biochar. Biomass burial has many of the same benefits as biochar. It is a potential solution to address the liability biomass bottleneck in New Mexico and elsewhere, supporting those larger forest restoration efforts. But instead of pyrolyzing the biomass, the idea is to simply bury it under certain conditions so that it won't decompose. Essentially, you want to create a vault that is relatively cool, dark, dry, and perhaps low in oxygen. You can cap the vault with soils and clays and plants and monitor the vault to make sure that it is performing as designed. And then wood that is left, compared to wood that is left in a slash pile, that slash pile wood would be expected to decay and release about 90% of its carbon into the atmosphere over a period of 100 years. And by comparison, over 90% of the carbon that is put in a wood vault is expected to remain after 100 years. Liz may well have insights into this, as I know that Yale Carbon Containment and Kodama are two entities that are exploring biomass burial, and we're part of that NREL Bikers team. So moving out of bikers, concrete has been mentioned a number of times already today. Indeed, concrete was chosen as the theme for the first Four Corners Carbon Coalition campaign. So why did we choose concrete? There are so many reasons. Not only is it the most common building material on Earth, but after water, it is the second most commonly used material on Earth. It is also carbon-intense industry. It accounts for between 8 and 10% of total emissions worldwide every year. So addressing concrete has huge potential impact. Concrete is also an inherently distributed and locally produced product. You're not going to be putting concrete on trucks and shipping it 1,000 miles. You need to produce it pretty close to where you use it. So the projects that are supported by our first campaign, they could easily be replicated all across the country and in fact, all across the world. So Orphan well plugging, this one is big, I think, for New Mexico. And it does combine two of the things that we've already discussed, and that would be biochar as well as concrete. Additionally, it provides a clear market use case for these materials to address a parallel climate issue, that of orphaned oil and gas wells. Unplugged, these wells emit greenhouse gases with absolutely no beneficial energy benefits. And nationally, it is estimated that there are currently over 3.2 million orphaned oil and gas wells in the United States, with as many as 72,000 in New Mexico alone. In the coming years, more will be orphaned, potentially millions more. Janice Hallowell is your expert to learn more about this. As mentioned earlier, she originated a piece of legislation that was passed in Colorado to study and pilot the use of these materials to plug these orphan wells. Janice is now working on developing sister bills and pilots in other states, including in New Mexico. So if this sounds like an area of collaboration that you might be interested in, once again, make sure to connect with Janice. Direct air capture, or DAC, is an engineered solution that's been mentioned before and is also, it's scalable. One might be able to think about a future with large utility scale installations and regional transport and storage infrastructure, or one could imagine smaller building integrated installations. This would be similar to acres of solar panels in the deserts or a few panels on your roof. DAC also has the flexibility to be integrated into either the storage or the utilization pathways. So there are a lot of potential economic entry points for DAC. One could imagine using the carbon from the DAC for the production of concrete. Concrete is actually able to absorb carbon dioxide under certain conditions. And if the carbon dioxide that it is absorbing comes from DAC, then it is a real solution that is drawing from the atmosphere and putting it in storage. But you could also imagine using that carbon for fuels, for textiles, for packaging, even for beverage carbonation. So Jason Hockman, again, is your panelist to ask for any of your direct air capture questions. And to build on perhaps these solar industry parallels, one might also think about a future where the procurement of carbon removal might be something that continues to grow and mature. We've already discussed how some companies are doing procurement. But one common solar procurement strategy is essentially to put out a request for a solar installation to be deployed in your own community. So this is on-site solar deployment. But another sort of strategy that has arisen in the past 20 years is the so-called power purchase agreement. And the PPA made it so that you didn't necessarily have to install solar on site to meet your renewable energy goals. Maybe you don't have space for it on site. And instead, companies and perhaps communities might be able to consider buying into large solar projects happening elsewhere in the world with an abundance of space, or perhaps they have an abundance of a solar or wind resource. And one could imagine large offsite carbon removal projects being set up similarly to take advantage of local resources or assets. Perhaps there's a large storage asset available in a particular part of the country. So indeed, parts of New Mexico seem like they may be well suited for a large-scale geologic storage project. And so these and other procurement ideas are some of the things that Kyle Clark Sutton with the Rocky Mountain Institute is interested in. If you'd like to know more, you could ask him during the panel. And I will wrap before getting to the panel with a quick overview of the Four Corners Carbon Coalition, because we may be able to provide additional near-term support to opportunities for communities in New Mexico that may be watching. One thing that Four Corners aims to address is some of the fear and some of the uncertainty that surrounds carbon removal, especially at this early stage of the industry. Taking the pulse of many in the country, it is pretty clear that there is some fear around carbon removal, that it's going to be something that is imposed upon communities without any input or agency. And the idea behind Four Corners campaigns is to try to flip that script, to work with communities, to evaluate the local context and the assets, to help communities and local governments to determine some themes or types of carbon dioxide removal that they would be interested in. That are locally relevant, and then to invite those types of projects into their backyards. And that is exactly what we did with our first communities in our first campaign. The first campaign was launched in October of 2022. Santa Fe participated in that campaign along with Boulder County, the city of Flagstaff, and Salt Lake City. And the ask of these four communities was for projects that would integrate carbon dioxide removal with concrete. And we got an amazing basket of proposals to review. The communities ultimately settled on 4 proposals that sort of rose to the top, and they provided catalytic grant funding to support their deployment. These projects took place in Flagstaff as well as in 3 communities in Colorado. You can learn about all of our projects at our website, which is fourcornerscarbon.org. And if you think that your community could be interested in learning more, just get in touch with us. We'd love to work with you to help make carbon dioxide more familiar to your community, to your decision makers, to your policy people. We would love to talk carbon removal. Or perhaps you've already seen enough and you think that you're ready to support locally imagined carbon removal initiatives. We'd love to hear from you and perhaps connect you with other communities that are interested in participating in upcoming Yes in My Backyard carbon removal campaigns. As mentioned, we're getting ready to do a second round of campaigns. Flagstaff, Boulder, and Santa Fe, among others, have communicated that they're interested in doing it again and trying to bring it even closer to home in Santa Fe's case. Great. And with that, I am done talking for a little while. Chris, I don't know if you've been able to monitor whether things are happening in the chat or Q&A, but I would love to transition and pivot to that point of the event.